And welcome back to the PT11 build. Today there's a few tasks that I'm going to undertake. So these include cleaning up the transom, gluing the gunnels together, and adding a cleat to the forward bulkhead. And the first step in cleaning up the transom was to cut the overhanging glass with a sharp utility knife. Now I'm just sanding the edges with a 120 sandpaper on a block. This just makes the edges nice and smooth. And next we'll move on to sanding the inside fiberglass and epoxy coated transom with the orbital sander. Here I'm using 120 grit and trying to get rid of all of the shine. The transom will be arced onto a former, so it's a lot easier to sand this while it's flat on the table before bending it onto the temporary former. So the goal here is to get a super smooth surface, remove all the shine, and certainly cut and grind down the overlapping edges of the small pieces of fiberglass that were laid across the top and down the center of the transom. The temporary former is held to the bench with a few clamps in a vertical position so that you can align the transom with the inside sanded surface facing up. So the goal here is to align the edges of the transom with the edges of the temporary former and right over top of the 4 holes in the transom, and then make a few small marks somewhere in the middle of these little slots on the edge of the former. And then with the transom removed, we're going to drill a few small holes through the center of the former in the 4 marks made, making sure that the drill is vertical and going deep enough to add a few screws. I then preset 1-inch number 4 steel screw into the holes just to sort of pre-drill so that they would find their way in easily once we add the transom back on. Then realigning the transom back in position, the 4 small screws are reset back into the transom using a couple of scrap strips as washers to force the transom down into a nice tight position on the former. And those 4 screws pull the transom into a nice arc on the former. Here I'm just doing a quick chamfer on one edge of the cleat, which will go on the forward bulkhead, using a round-over bit and a laminate trimmer. Next is to position the cleat on the underside of the top edge of the forward bulkhead. And once you've got it nicely aligned end to end and top to edge, just going to drive a few small finishing nails in, and these will be used basically to reposition the cleat when the epoxy is added. These 2 small finishing nails will go right back into the hole they've made so that when thickened epoxy is added, the cleat does not slide around when you try to clamp it down. Now I'll gently just pry the finishing nails back out enough so that I can remove the cleat. So with that ready and done, it's time to mix up some epoxy and start to apply epoxy to the cleat, to the gunnel joints, and then assemble everything on the bench. The first task is to Brush unthickened epoxy onto all the mating surfaces. This allows the wood to suck up as much epoxy as it can. We call this sort of priming the wood before thickening the epoxy to glue the joints together. The cleat and the plywood face of the transom won't really suck up that much epoxy, but on other portions of the build where there's end grain, you certainly need to add enough epoxy so that the wood will take up as much as it can before thickening your epoxy for the glue joint. So now I'm moving on to the 4 joints that will make up the gunnels. And here you can see that this would be considered the end grain or edge grain of the plywood. Hence I'm going to brush all of the mating surfaces with unthickened epoxy, let it soak in for a little bit, then I'm going to come back again to where I started and brush on some more. Now it's time to thicken the remaining epoxy with silica. Here I'm using a mixture of about 2 parts silica to 1 part fairing compound. And what you don't see in the video is I'm definitely wearing my dust mask. This is not the type of particles that you want to be breathing in. So then we're going to give it a good stir, mix it very well. It should be the consistency of thick peanut butter so that it doesn't drip off a brush. And then we're just going to gently dab and brush it onto one of the mating surfaces between the 2 joints. You need to add enough thickened epoxy to fill the gap or any gap between the joint, but not so much that it's squeezing out everywhere, as you just have to clean that up and sand it off later. Now I'm just going to add a little to the surface of the cleat, and we're ready to assemble all the parts and pieces. With all of the surfaces fully saturated and coated in thickened epoxy, it's time to align all of the joints on the gunnels and the cleat and clamp everything together. So we can just add the cleat back to the top of the forward bulkhead. It should line up exactly where the pinholes are from the finishing nails. I'm just going to drive those right into there, and then add a couple of clamps to squeeze everything out and hold it tight and let the epoxy cure. If you've added enough thickened epoxy, you should see just a little bit squeezing out of the joint on all the surfaces. Then you'll want to take a small scrap piece of wood, kind of shaped like a chisel, just to clean off any squeeze out in there. And we'll move on to clamping the gunnels together. I'm going to use 3 2-inch C-clamps, placing the first 2 right over the edge. This kind of helps to align the pieces from not sliding along, and then a third one in the middle. And once they're all in place, I just like to turn the clamps so they're facing upwards. This gives me good clearance underneath them so that I can get in and clean out the squeeze out of the thickened epoxy. And again, just using my chisel stick to scrape off the excess squeeze out now and wiping it off on a rag. And then we're going to tighten down those 3 clamps one last time and add some blocking to the top to force them down onto the table. So what I have here, just scrap pieces of wood covered in clear packing tape, and I'm using a 3-inch C-clamp which I will use to force the two pieces of the gunnel down so that they are flush with the table and flush with each other. And with that one first joint done, I can move on to the other three, clamp them all down to the table, and as you can see, here's the first and the second joint with the gunnel sort of near the edge of the table, and I've moved the second gunnel to the other side so I can repeat the process. And again, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to follow this build and other builds on OrcaBoats.